The morning sky bled crimson as Wylie Anderson's world burned before her eyes. The schoolhouse she'd poured her heart into for 3 years now engulfed in merciless flames that licked at the dawn sky. She had rushed there after waking to the church bells ringing in alarm, only to find herself trapped inside while attempting to salvage her students' work and her precious books. Sweetwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878, was no place for faint hearts. Wylie had learned that when she'd arrived from Boston at 22, determined to bring education to the frontier. Now, at 25, choking on smoke and heat, she wondered if her journey would end here, amid the crackling timber and falling debris. The schoolhouse had been her pride, a single-room building at the edge of town, where 30 children gathered daily to learn their letters and figures. She had stayed late the previous night preparing for the spring pageant, unaware that the pot-bellied stove's faulty pipe would smolder and ignite while she slept in her small cabin a quarter-mile away. "Help!" she called out, though her voice barely carried through the dense smoke. Her skirts were heavy, her movement restricted as she stumbled over a fallen beam. The heat was unbearable, pressing against her like an invisible wall. Through the haze and flickering orange light, Wylie heard the thunder of hooves. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered and determined, before disappearing into the billowing smoke. "Where are you?" a deep voice called out. "Here." She tried to move toward the voice, but found her foot caught beneath a collapsed shelf. Then he was there, materializing through the smoke like a specter, Mason O'Rourke, whose cattle ranch bordered the northern edge of town. He was known for keeping to himself, for his hard work and fair dealings, but also for the shadows that seemed to follow him. His face, usually stoic beneath his wide-brimmed hat, now showed nothing but fierce determination as he assessed the situation in seconds. "Miss Anderson," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle amid the chaos, "I'm going to get you out." With a swift motion, Mason lifted the heavy shelf from her foot, then scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She felt the solid strength of him, smelled leather and horses, and the faint trace of soap beneath the acrid smoke. "Hold on," he ordered, and Wylie clutched at his shirt as he turned toward the door, which was now nearly blocked by flames. Without hesitation, Mason wrapped her more tightly in his arms, shielding her face against his chest before charging through the wall of fire. The heat singed her skirts and the ends of her hair, but his body protected her from the worst of it. Outside, the cool morning air hit her lungs like a blessing. Mason carried her a safe distance away before setting her gently on the grass. All around them, townspeople had gathered with buckets, forming a futile line from the creek, but the schoolhouse was beyond saving. "Are you hurt?" Mason asked, his green eyes intense as they scanned her for injuries. Wylie coughed, struggling to find her voice. "My ankle, perhaps." "But I'll be fine." She looked up at him, this man she knew only in passing. "Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. I would have don't mention it," he said gruffly, standing and taking a step back. Anyone would have done the same, but they both knew that wasn't true. Mason had ridden straight through smoke and flames when others stood at a safe distance, unsure what to do. Sheriff Dawkins approached them, his weathered face grave. "Miss Anderson, thank the Lord you're alive. O'Rourke, that was some of the bravest foolishness I've ever seen." Mason merely nodded, already retreating emotionally even as he stood there. "I should get back to my ranch. Got cattle that need tending." "At least let Doc Perkins look at those burns on your hands," Wylie insisted, noticing the angry red marks across his palms and fingers. He flexed his hands dismissively. "Had worse from branding season." Before Wylie could protest further, Mrs. Forrester from the boarding house was at her side, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and clucking with concern. When she looked back, Mason was already mounting his horse, a solid buckskin gelding that pawed impatiently at the ground. Their eyes met briefly across the gathering crowd, and something passed between them, an unspoken connection that Wylie couldn't explain. Then he tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away as the schoolhouse crumbled into fiery ruins behind him. 2 days later, Wylie sat on the porch of Mrs. Forrester's boarding house, her bandaged ankle propped on a stool, watching as men from town cleared the charred remains of her schoolhouse. The town council had already met and decided to rebuild, but it would take weeks. Until then, her students would have no lessons and she would have no purpose. "Miss Anderson," a small voice drew her attention. Lily Dawkins, the sheriff's 10-year-old daughter, stood at the bottom of the steps clutching something to her chest. "Hello, Lily. What brings you here today? Pa said you lost all your books in the fire." The girl climbed the steps and held out a worn copy of Little Women. "You can borrow mine if you want. You read it to us last year and it was my favorite." Tears welled in Wylie's eyes as she accepted the gift. "That's very thoughtful, Lily. Thank you." As Lily skipped away, Wylie noticed a rider approaching from the north. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight-backed posture and the distinctive buckskin horse. Mason O'Rourke rode with purpose, leading a packhorse laden with lumber. He dismounted in front of the charred schoolhouse foundation, speaking briefly with the men working there. They nodded and began unloading the timber he'd brought. Wylie watched, perplexed, as he rolled up his sleeves and joined them in the work. Mrs. Forrester appeared with a glass of lemonade. "Well, look at that, the O'Rourke boy lending a hand. Does he not usually?" Wylie asked. The older woman sniffed. "Keeps to himself, that one. Been here 5 years and barely speaks 10 words together. Some say he's running from something back east. Course, half the men in this territory are." Wylie studied Mason as he worked. His movements were efficient, his focus unwavering. She had always seen him from afar at church occasionally or passing through town for supplies. He'd been polite but distant, tipping his hat without lingering for conversation. "I should thank him properly," Wylie decided, attempting to stand. "You'll do no such thing on that ankle, Mrs. Forrester scolded. "If you're determined, I'll send my Jimmy to fetch him over once they break for midday." When Mason approached the boarding house an hour later, Wylie felt an unexpected flutter of nerves. He removed his hat as he climbed the steps, revealing dark hair damp with sweat from his labor. The burns on his hands were now wrapped in clean bandages. "Miss Anderson," he said with a nod, "you're looking better." "Thanks to you, Mr. O'Rourke. Please sit." She gestured to the chair beside her. He hesitated before settling into it stiffly, his hat resting on his knee. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of sun and hardship rather than age. "I wanted to thank you properly," she began. "Not just for the rescue, but for the lumber. You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "The children need their learning, can't have them running wild all spring." "Do you have children, Mr. O'Rourke?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed his face. "No, madam. Never married." Mrs. Forrester appeared with 2 glasses of lemonade and a plate of cookies, giving them a knowing smile that made Wylie blush. After the older woman left, Mason spoke quietly. "How's the ankle? Improving? Dr. Perkins says I should stay off it for another week." She sipped her lemonade. "I'm afraid I'm not very good at sitting idle." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I noticed that when you were trying to save those books instead of yourself." Wylie laughed softly. "Books have always been precious to me, more valuable than most things." "What made you come out here? Sweetwater Creek isn't exactly Boston." There was genuine curiosity in his voice. She considered the question. "After my parents died, there was nothing holding me there. I saw an advertisement for a teacher needed in Wyoming territory. It seemed like a chance to build something meaningful." Mason nodded, and Wylie sensed he understood more than she'd said. "And you?" she asked. "What brought you to Wyoming?" His expression closed slightly. "Looking for a fresh start." He didn't elaborate, and Wylie didn't press. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment before Mason cleared his throat. "I should get back to work." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "If you need anything, Miss Anderson, you just send word to the Double Circle Ranch." "I will, and please call me Wylie." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Wylie, he repeated, as if testing how it felt to say her name. I'm Mason. It was a small thing, this exchange of first names, but as he walked back toward the schoolhouse site, Wylie felt as though something significant had shifted between them. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason came to town every day with more lumber, tools, or men from his ranch to help with the rebuilding. Wylie's ankle healed, and soon she was able to walk to the construction site to watch the progress. Sometimes she brought sandwiches and coffee for the workers, and always she found a moment to speak with Mason. Their conversations were brief, but increasingly comfortable. She learned he had grown up in Pennsylvania, that he preferred autumn to any other season, and that he could identify any bird in the territory by its call alone. He never spoke of family or his life before Wyoming, and Wylie sensed those topics were close to her. What she didn't tell him was how she found herself looking forward to their daily interactions, or how she noticed the way his serious expression would soften when he spotted her approaching. 3 weeks after the fire, Sheriff Dawkins stopped her after church. Miss Anderson, the council's agreed we need to get the children back to learning before the new schoolhouse is finished. We've arranged for you to use the back room of the mercantile for now. Can start tomorrow if you're willing. Of course, Wylie said eagerly. Thank you, Sheriff. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Mason, who had been standing behind her. Good news about the temporary classroom, he said. Yes, I've missed teaching terribly. She hesitated, then asked, will you still come to town now that you're not needed for the building? Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. Got to check on the progress, don't I? Make sure they're not wasting my lumber, she smiled, understanding the words beneath his words. I'll look forward to your inspections then. The makeshift classroom was cramped but functional. Wylie threw herself back into teaching with renewed passion, grateful for every book and slate the townspeople had donated to replace what was lost. The children, too, seemed to appreciate their lessons more after the interruption. Each day, Mason would find some reason to ride into town. Sometimes he brought a rabbit or fresh fish for Mrs. Forrester's kitchen. Other times he claimed to need supplies from the mercantile, but he always stopped by the classroom, lingering at the doorway until Wylie dismissed her students. One afternoon in late April, as the new schoolhouse neared completion, Mason appeared at the mercantile with a small wooden crate. What's this? Wylie asked as he set it on her desk after the children had gone. Found these at my place. Thought you might want them for your new school. He stepped back, almost nervous as she opened the crate. Inside were books, at least 20 of them, their leather bindings worn but well cared for. Wylie lifted one out reverently. Pride and Prejudice, she read aloud, then looked up at him in wonder. These are yours. A faint flush colored his cheeks. Brought them with me when I came west. Haven't had much time for reading lately. Wylie ran her fingers over the embossed cover. Mason, I can't accept these. They're too valuable. They're just gathering dust at my place, he said with a shrug. Books should be read, not hidden away. She studied him with new eyes, this man who rode through fire to save her, who brought lumber for her school, and now offered his own cherished books. Would you stay a while? She asked impulsively. Perhaps read with me. The invitation clearly surprised him, but after a moment's hesitation, he pulled up a chair beside her desk. Wylie opened Pride and Prejudice to the first page and began to read aloud. Mason listened, his eyes never leaving her face, as Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy began their complicated dance toward love. When she finished the first chapter, he took the book gently from her hands. My turn, he said, and began reading in a rich, steady voice that revealed years of practice and appreciation. That evening marked the beginning of a ritual. 3 times a week, after school hours, they would meet and read together. Sometimes at the mercantile, sometimes on the porch of the boarding house, occasionally walking slowly along the creek that gave the town its name. The townspeople noticed, of course. Wylie caught the speculative glances, heard the whispers that stopped when she entered a room. Mrs. Forrester was particularly transparent in her matchmaking efforts, finding reasons to leave them alone and mentioning Mason's virtues at every opportunity. "He's built that ranch up from nothing," she told Wylie one evening as they prepared dinner. "Works harder than any 3 men. And he's educated too, though he doesn't show it much." "We're just friends," Wylie insisted, though her heated cheeks betrayed her. Mrs. Forrester merely smiled knowingly. "Course you are, dear." May brought warmer weather and the completion of the new schoolhouse. It stood proudly on the site of the old one, larger and sturdier, with large windows to let in the light and a new slate blackboard donated by the town council. The night before classes were to resume in the new building, Mason invited Wylie to dinner at his ranch. It was the first time she had seen the double circle, and she was impressed by the neat log house, sturdy barn, and well-maintained corrals. 3 ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully as Mason led her to the house. "It's not much," he said, watching her reaction carefully, "but it's mine." "It's wonderful," she replied sincerely. The main room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and, to her delight, bookshelves built into one entire wall, half filled with the volumes he hadn't given to her. He had clearly gone to great lengths for the meal, serving venison stew, fresh bread, and even apple pie for dessert. They ate at a small table by the window where they could watch the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. "I've never asked," Wylie said as they finished their pie, "why did you ride to the schoolhouse that morning? You live miles away." Mason set down his fork and met her eyes. "I was on my way to town early, saw the smoke from the ridge." He paused. "When I realized it was the school, I couldn't bear the thought that you might be inside." The simple admission hung in the air between them. "I'm glad it was you who found me," she said softly. Later, as he walked her to the buggy he'd borrowed to bring her to the ranch, Mason stopped beneath an old cottonwood tree. The evening was mild, the air sweet with the scent of spring grass. "Wylie," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips, "these past weeks have been—" "Yes," she agreed, understanding all he wasn't saying, "for me too." He took her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of ranch work. "I'm not good with words, not like in those books we read, but I think I've been waiting for you my whole life." Wylie's heart pounded as he stepped closer. She had known this was coming, had felt it building between them with each shared page, each conversation, each lingering glance. "I wasn't looking for love when I came to Wyoming," she whispered, "but I'm very glad I found it." When he kissed her, it was tender and questioning at first, then deeper as she responded. His arms around her felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. The first month of school in the new building passed in a blur of happiness for Wylie. By day, she taught her students with renewed enthusiasm. Evenings and Sundays belonged to Mason as they continued their readings, took long rides across his ranch, or simply sat talking on Mrs. Forrester's porch. The entire town seemed to approve of their courtship, with even Sheriff Dawkins remarking that "O'Rourke smiles now," which takes some getting used to. But Wylie sensed there were still parts of himself that Mason kept hidden. Sometimes a shadow would cross his face at an innocent question, or he would grow distant when certain topics arose. She didn't press, trusting that he would share his past when he was ready. That moment came on a warm June evening. They had ridden to a high meadow on the double circle where wildflowers painted the grass in swaths of color. Mason spread a blanket for them to sit on while they watched the sunset. "I need to tell you something," he said after a long silence, "about why I came west." Wylie took his hand encouragingly. "You don't have to, I do. Before we go any further, you need to know." He took a deep breath. "I was a teacher back in Pennsylvania." This surprised her. "A teacher," he nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "At a small private school. I loved it. Taught history and literature to boys who would likely take over their father's businesses someday. What happened? There was a fire." His voice grew tight. "Much like your schoolhouse, but it happened at night when the boarding students were asleep. I was reading late in my quarters and smelled the smoke. Wylie's hand tightened around his. "Oh, Mason." "I got most of them out, carried them, pushed them through windows, whatever it took, but 2 boys." His voice broke. "2 boys died. It wasn't your fault," she said gently. The parents didn't see it that way. There was an inquiry. I was cleared of any negligence. The fire started in the kitchen, where a cook had left a stove unattended. But the whispers followed me. The fathers of those boys were powerful men. They made sure I'd never teach again in Pennsylvania. Wylie moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "So you came west, started over, bought land, built something new." He turned to look at her directly. "I never thought I'd find my way back to books, to teaching in some form." "Then you were trapped in that fire, and it was like being given a second chance. To save me," she asked, "to save a piece of myself I thought was gone forever." He cupped her face in his hands. "Wylie Anderson, you've restored something I believed was lost, and I love you for it. For everything you are." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she pressed her forehead to his. "I love you too, Mason. Your past, your present, and whatever future we might build together." When he proposed minutes later, beneath the fading light of the western sky, her yes was immediate and sure. They were married in July, in a ceremony beside the new schoolhouse. The entire town attended, along with Mason's ranch hands and even a few families who had traveled from neighboring settlements. Sheriff Dawkins gave the bride away, and Mrs. Forrester wept openly throughout the service. Wylie wore a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair. Mason, uncomfortably handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows. At the celebration afterward, held in the schoolyard, Lily Dawkins approached them shyly. "Does this mean you won't be our teacher anymore, Miss Anderson?" Wylie exchanged a glance with Mason before answering. "Actually, I'll still be your teacher, but my name will be Mrs. O'Rourke now. And," Mason added, surprising both Wylie and the girl, "I might come help sometimes. Perhaps teach some history or literature to the older students if that's allowed." Wylie's heart swelled with love and pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea." That night, as they rode to the double circle now their shared home, Mason pulled his horse alongside hers. "Are you sure this is what you want? Living at the ranch might make your teaching duties more difficult." "I'm exactly where I want to be," she assured him. "Besides, being a rancher's wife doesn't mean I can't be a teacher too. I'll make it work." He smiled, the last of his habitual reserve melting away. "You're remarkable, Wylie O'Rourke, as are you, my brave cowboy who rides through fire." She nudged her horse into a trot. "Race you home." 1 year later, Wylie stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Mason taught their newest ranch hand how to properly mend a fence. Her hand rested on her growing belly where their first child, a son, she was certain would arrive before winter. The schoolhouse in town now had 2 teachers. Wylie taught 3 days a week, while Mason, who had finally shared his educational background with the town council, taught the other 2. The arrangement had raised eyebrows at first, but the children's improved test scores and enthusiasm for learning had quickly silenced any doubters. They had converted one room of the ranch house into a library, combining their books and adding new ones with every supply order to Denver. In the evenings, they still read aloud to each other, a tradition they planned to continue with their children. "What are you thinking about, looking so content?" Mason asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "How strangely life turns," she replied, leaning back against him. "If that schoolhouse hadn't caught fire at dawn, if you hadn't ridden through smoke and carried me out, I'd have found you eventually," he said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be. Is that so, Mr. O'Rourke?" "I never took you for a romantic." He turned her gently in his arms, his hand cradling her belly protectively. "You've changed me in many ways, Mrs. O'Rourke. For the better, I hope," she teased, "in every way possible." His kiss was as tender as the first time, yet filled with the deeper understanding and love that had grown between them. That night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Wylie thought of the fire that had nearly taken her life but had instead given her everything she never knew she wanted. a home, a purpose. A love strong enough to heal old wounds and brave enough to face whatever the frontier might bring. "I love you," she whispered to Mason, whose breathing had already deepened towards sleep, his arm tightened around her. "And I love you, always will." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere on the double circle, a night bird answered. Wylie drifted to sleep in the arms of her cowboy, grateful for smoke and flame and all the unexpected paths that had led them to each other.